The first thing my daughter heard that evening wasn't my voice. It was a stranger's voice, shouting over sirens, borrowing her father's phone to tell her where to find him. My name is Walter Krause. I'm 61 years old, a retired plumbing contractor from Millbrook, Ohio. And 2 hours before that call, my daughter had told me to figure out my own way home from her mother's grave. For 39 years, my wife Carol ran our house the way she ran everything else, with a checklist in one hand and a casserole in the other. I was the quiet one. I fixed what broke and didn't ask for credit. Carol used to say I love people the way I fixed pipes, from underneath, where nobody has to watch. I thought that was a compliment for most of my life. I've since learned it can also be a warning. 4 days before the accident, I stood in a small chapel outside Asheville, North Carolina, watching them lower Carol into the ground. She'd spent her last 3 months down there with her brother, chasing a clinical trial that never quite worked the way the doctors hoped. I flew back and forth 11 times that spring. Each flight home felt a little more like leaving half of myself behind in that hospital room. Then one Thursday afternoon, the doctor stopped saying, "We're hopeful," and started saying, "Make her comfortable." And 4 days after that, there was nothing left to hope for. The service was small, the way Carol wanted. No big flowers, no long speeches, just her brother's family, a few old friends from the church choir, and a recording of Patsy Cline she used to hum while she did the dishes. When it ended, I stood by the fresh dirt until the groundskeeper came over, hat in his hands, and told me they needed to lock the gate. I told him I understood. I didn't, not really. Tomorrow felt like a place I didn't know how to get to yet. I flew home to Ohio the next morning with one carry-on bag and Carol's wedding ring in my shirt pocket because I couldn't stand to look at my own hand without hers next to it. On the plane, I watched the clouds and thought about how she used to grab my arm during turbulence and whisper that if we made it down safe, I owed her a hot fudge sundae. I always paid up. 41 Sundays over 39 years, by her count. She kept a real count. The seat beside me on that flight had never felt so wide. We landed at Port Columbus a little after 4:30. I sat there while everyone else stood and shuffled toward the aisle because there was no version of hurrying that made sense anymore. Nobody was timing how long I took. So I opened the family group chat me. My son Curtis, my daughter Renee, Curtis's wife Amber, and my 2 grandkids, who mostly used it to post pictures from soccer practice. I typed, "Landing at 4:45. Anybody able to swing by and grab me?" I read it 3 times before I sent it. I've never liked asking my own children for anything. 40 years of being the one who shows up will do that to a man. Curtis answered first. "Can't today, Dad. Slammed at work. Grab a Lyft." I stared at that for longer than I should have. Then Renee's message landed right under it. "Yeah, Dad, you really should have planned this better. We all have jobs." Planned it better. As if grief ran on a school pickup schedule. As if burying the only woman I ever loved was supposed to fit neatly between Curtis's sales calls and Renee's parent-teacher conferences. My thumb hovered over the keyboard a long time. I could have told them where I'd just come from. I could have reminded them their mother had been in the ground less than 24 hours. Instead, I typed 2 words. "No problem." I hit send, put the phone face down in my jacket, and understood something I'd been avoiding for a long time. You cannot make people show up who've already decided not to. Outside baggage claim, Columbus gave me a gray sky and a wind that cut through my coat. Cars honked, families hugged at the curb. A little boy ran circles around his mother's suitcase, laughing at nothing in particular. Life kept right on going, the way it always does, completely unbothered by the fact that mine had just been cut in half. I wheeled my bag toward the rideshare pickup, my knees aching more from 3 sleepless weeks than from age. While I waited, I noticed an older woman, 2 spots down, struggling to lift a suitcase into her son's trunk. I walked over without thinking about it. "Let me get that for you." She thanked me, said she hoped somebody would do the same for me someday. I told her I hoped so too, and I meant it more than she knew. That's when the world came apart. A tanker truck hauling propane had jackknifed on the exit ramp after a pickup clipped its rear axle, and by the time I turned toward the sound, 3 more cars had piled into the wreckage. Flames were already climbing the side of an overturned minivan. People were screaming, filming, backing away, doing all the things people do when their bodies understand a thing their minds haven't caught up to yet. I'd spent 22 years running our county's volunteer fire auxiliary before I retired from plumbing full-time, running dispatch drills and hauling hose at 3 in the morning for no pay and no thanks. Something in me just moved before I decided to let it. I dropped my suitcase. A stranger grabbed my sleeve and told me not to go near it, that it could blow. I told him somebody already called it in, and I pulled free and ran anyway. The minivan's side door was jammed, and through the smoke-fogged window I could see a woman clawing at her seatbelt, a boy no older than 7 screaming in the back seat. The gas smell was thick enough to taste. I grabbed a chunk of broken curb and swung it into the window until it gave, and I kept swinging until there was enough glass gone to reach through. "Cover his eyes," I yelled at her. And she did, and I pulled shards away with my bare hands while the sirens got closer, but never close enough. All I could think, the whole time, was that Carol would never have let me stand there and watch. Not after what she just survived and lost herself. A cop reached me first, hand on my shoulder, yelling for me to get behind the line. I pointed instead. "There's a hand in that back window. That sedan's still got somebody in it," and he didn't waste a second sending 2 firefighters running past me. That's when I noticed my palms were shredded from the glass, and my sleeve had scorched clean through where the flame had licked across my forearm. I hadn't felt any of it happening. 40 minutes later, when the fire was finally out and the road was a river of flashing lights, an officer with a clipboard asked my name. Walter Krause, 61. He looked at me a beat too long and said I ought to be in one of those ambulances. "I've had worse," I told him, and he almost smiled and said his wife says that exact thing about every man over 60. The word wife hit me like a second collision. I told him I'd buried mine yesterday. His smile disappeared fast. He kept the questions short after that. Witnesses kept interrupting, telling the officer I was leaving things out, that I'd gone back into the wreckage 3 separate times, that everybody else had just stood there filming while I kept running toward it. I told him there'd been firefighters. A young woman standing nearby shook her head. "Not at first. They got there because you bought everybody time." I didn't know what to say to that. I hadn't been counting. I'd just seen people who needed somebody. A paramedic about my granddaughter's age cleaned the cuts on my hands and asked if somebody was coming to pick me up. I almost laughed. "You sure?" "And I'm sure," I told her. She asked if I had family nearby. I said I did. She asked if they'd been told. "They're busy," I said. And she didn't ask anything else after that, just handed me a water bottle and said she hoped I'd get a ride home. So did I. A reporter found me next, a young woman named Dana Ferris from the local NBC affiliate, camera guy trailing behind her. I told her I wasn't interested in being on television. She said firefighters were telling her 3 people would likely be dead if I hadn't gone in. I told her I was glad they weren't, and that was all I had to say. She nodded, said fair enough, and walked off without pushing. I appreciated that more than she'll ever know. Carol always respected people who could take no for a full answer. The roads out by the airport were closed for hours, so a squad car ran me to a Holiday Inn a few exits down where stranded travelers were bunking up for the night. I checked into a room with beige carpet and a window overlooking the parking lot, and for the first time all day, it was quiet. I set my bag on the dresser. Inside was the cardigan Carol had insisted on packing for the flight down, even though she never once wore it in 3 months of North Carolina heat. It still smelled like her hand cream. I sat on the edge of that bed holding it, and that's when I finally cried, not for the wreck, not for my hands, but because there would never again be a text from Carol asking if I'd landed safe. Across town, my children had no idea where I was. Curtis was finishing dinner with Amber and their teenage daughter. Renee was helping her youngest with a book report. Neither had turned on the news yet. Curtis glanced at the group chat and noticed his dad had gone quiet after. No problem. Amber asked if his father had made it home okay. "He's a grown man. He took a Lyft," Curtis said, and Amber didn't argue, but something in her face stayed there a beat too long. About an hour later, Curtis's phone started buzzing a neighbor, then an old coworker, then his manager. "Turn on Channel 10. Now." He grabbed the remote. A helicopter shot filled the screen, smoke, flame, a wall of flashing lights, and then the camera zoomed in on a gray-haired man in a scorched jacket climbing through the shattered window of a burning minivan. Amber whispered his father's name before Curtis could even form the word. The anchor was already saying it out loud. Retired Millbrook contractor Walter Krause had gone back into the wreckage repeatedly before first responders had the scene secured. Then the footage cut to me standing by an ambulance, blood running down my sleeve, and a caption underneath reading that Krause had reportedly flown in that same evening from his wife's funeral in North Carolina. Across the city, Renee got almost the identical phone call from her friend Patty. "I think your dad's on every station in Columbus." She laughed it off until she turned on the television herself, and then she covered her mouth and didn't say anything at all. When the segment replayed the footage a second time, with the funeral detail on screen, she thought about the lonely flight home she hadn't stopped to imagine. Not even once, and she started to cry. My phone sat face down on that hotel nightstand all night. I never felt it buzzing. I woke up a little before 6, and for a few merciful seconds, I forgot where I was, forgot the hotel, forgot the funeral, forgot Carol was gone. Then my hand reached across the bed and found nothing but cold sheets, and it all came rushing back at once. I finally picked up the phone around 8. 31 missed calls. Dozens of texts. Curtis: "Dad, where are you? Please call." Renee: "Dad, please answer. We're scared. Please don't be alone." I read them and didn't answer. Not out of spite, just because I wasn't ready to talk yet. Grief doesn't always leave room for conversation. There was a knock at the door around 9. It was Dana, the reporter, looking almost embarrassed. She said the hotel manager had recognized me from the morning news and she wasn't there to shove a camera in my face. She had a message from the hospital. The little boy I'd pulled out was going to be fine. His parents wanted me to know. He kept asking about the man who broke the window. I laughed for the first time in days and told her his parents had probably warned him plenty about climbing through broken glass since. She smiled, said there were about 20 reporters camped outside and that she wouldn't tell them where I was. She kept her word. Meanwhile, Curtis and Renee had met at my house at 7 that morning. The house Carol had picked out 31 years ago and never once talked about leaving. Curtis let them in with the spare key I'd given him back in college. Everything sat exactly as I'd left it. Carol's reading chair angled toward the window, my boots by the back door, except the kitchen didn't smell like coffee, because for 3 decades Carol had always been up first, and now there was nobody. Renee noticed the little dish of dried lilacs still sitting on the hutch. "Mom always put those out before their anniversary," she said, and neither of them said much else for a long minute. They decided to clean the house before I came home, mostly because it gave their hands something to do besides think. That's when Renee found the shoebox. Not a chest, not journals, just an old boot box tucked on the closet shelf above Carol's winter coats, stuffed with receipts, bank statements, and a stack of birthday cards Carol had never mailed. Underneath all of it were 4 spiral notebooks, each one labeled by year in Carol's handwriting. Renee said they shouldn't look. Curtis said their mother would have wanted them to. Neither of them believed it, but they opened the top one anyway. The early pages were nothing: grocery lists, a vacation itinerary, a recipe for the lemon bars Carol brought to every church potluck. Then one entry stopped them cold. "Walter sold the boat today," told Curtis. The motor finally gave out. Really, he used every dollar toward Curtis's truck payment after the shop laid him off last winter. He'll never forgive himself if Curtis finds out he almost lost that job over pride. Curtis went white reading it. Renee turned another page. Renee's lawyer called again about the custody filing. Walter quietly pulled it from what was left of his 401k. Told the kids we were simplifying for retirement. I hate watching him lie to protect their dignity, but I understand exactly why he does it. Renee pressed her hand over her mouth. I thought you two really wanted to downsize," she whispered, and nobody was there yet to answer her. Page after page, year after year, it was the same story dressed up in different disguises. I'd taken on side jobs after retirement not because I was bored, but because Curtis's HVAC business had nearly gone under its first winter. I'd driven the same 14-year-old F-150 because Renee's oldest needed a hearing aid insurance wouldn't fully cover. I'd skipped my own hip surgery for 2 extra years because tuition kept climbing. I never once said a word about any of it. Then Renee found an entry from 4 months back, the ink a little shakier than the rest, and read it out loud through tears. "The doctors down in Asheville think there's one more trial worth trying. Walter insists we do it. He emptied almost everything left in our savings today and smiled the whole time he signed the forms. I know exactly what it cost him. If I don't make it, I pray our children never mistake his silence for not caring. Underneath that quiet is the biggest heart I have ever known." Curtis put his face in his hands and his shoulders started shaking. "I thought Dad was just cheap," he said. "So did I," Renee whispered back. Neither of them had ever once asked why I still wore my winter coat from 2009 or why I always said I was doing just fine. They'd simply accepted it, because accepting takes so much less out of a person than asking does. Amber showed up around noon with sandwiches and knew something was wrong the second she walked in. Curtis handed her a notebook without a word. She read 3 pages, sat down hard next to her husband, and said she was so sorry. Curtis just kept staring at the floor. "I told him to take a Lyft," he said. "I know," Amber answered, holding his hand. "What matters now is what you do next." That afternoon, I was sitting alone on a bench along the Scioto River, watching the water move under a gray sky when my phone rang. This time I picked up. For a long few seconds, Curtis couldn't get any words out at all. And then, through tears, I heard 3 words. "Dad, come home." 3 words I would have given almost anything to hear 24 hours earlier. I didn't yell. I didn't hang up on him. I just told him I wasn't ready yet, and I meant it kindly, and I ended the call not to punish him, but because my heart needed a little more room before it could stretch that far. I walked the riverfront the rest of that day. Runners went by. A busker played guitar near the farmers market stalls, same as any other Tuesday. The world doesn't pause just because one family is coming apart at the seams, and Carol had always understood that better than I did. "The world keeps turning, Walter," she used to tell me. "We just decide whether we're still walking with it." I wasn't sure, that afternoon, that I remembered how. My phone rang again. Dana this time. I told her we'd agreed, no interviews. She said she wasn't calling for the station, the mayor's office wanted to give me some kind of recognition, and she had no interest in that either. But there was one more thing she wanted to ask. "I'd like to tell this story the right way," she said. "Right now, every outlet's calling you a hero and guessing at why you were standing at that curb alone." I told her they didn't need to know why. She was quiet a second, then said, "I think they do. Because loneliness is something a lot of people understand." That answer surprised me enough that I let her keep talking. She told me her own father had died alone in a care facility during the pandemic, and she never got to say goodbye, and she'd spent 4 years wishing she'd made one more call. I told her I was sorry. She asked if I'd sit for one interview, no music, no ambush questions, and if I didn't like something, she asked, I didn't have to answer it. I thought about Carol, who always believed telling a story honestly could heal something. I said yes. We sat down the next morning in a quiet conference room at Riverside Methodist, just 2 chairs and 1 small camera. Dana asked if I'd been afraid, running toward those cars. I told her of course I had. She asked why I kept going back anyway. I thought about 39 years with Carol, about every hospital hallway and every long night holding her hand while she slept through the pain. When you've loved somebody that long, I said, being scared stops being the point. You stop asking if it's dangerous and start asking if somebody needs you. Then she asked the question that mattered most. Did my family know I was coming home that night? I knew what every viewer in 3 states was waiting to hear. I could have told them everything. The texts, the no problem, all of it. Instead, I said my kids had busy lives, families of their own, more on their plates than I ever carried at their age, and that sometimes life gets complicated and people can't come. She studied me a second and said I didn't sound angry. I told her I'd had enough sadness that week without adding anger on top of it. That clip went everywhere by nightfall, not because of the rescue, but because of 8 words. They have busy lives. People started posting that their own parents said the exact same thing to cover for them. Curtis watched it alone in his office and put his head down on the desk. Renee watched it with her daughter curled up beside her. And when her little girl asked why Grandpa was being so nice about it, Renee didn't have an answer that didn't break her heart a little. That evening, my porch filled up with casseroles and cards from neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months. Somebody mowed my lawn without ringing the bell. When I finally drove home that night, Curtis and Renee were both sitting out front in lawn chairs, no phones in their hands, just waiting. Neither of them said a word when I stepped out of the truck. Curtis came down the steps and took my suitcase from my hand before I could argue. And it hit me that the last time he'd carried a bag for me, he'd been about 11 years old. Renee had made coffee using Carol's old percolator, and it didn't taste anything like her mother's. And we all laughed about that together, and it was the first real laugh I'd had since the funeral. We sat at the kitchen table that night, the same table where Carol had hosted every Thanksgiving for 3 decades, and Renee set one of the notebooks down between us. "We read all of it," she said. Curtis nodded and asked why I'd never told him about the boat, about the retirement money, about any of it. "Because helping you wasn't supposed to turn into something you owed me," I told him. Renee put her face in her hands and said she kept thinking about her own text. "You should have planned this better," and that she'd actually typed those words to a man who'd just buried his wife. You can't take it back, I told her, reaching over to put my hand on hers. But you get to decide who you become after it. Curtis asked me something that had clearly been sitting on him all day. Why hadn't I told that reporter the truth? Why hadn't I let the whole state see what they'd really done? I told him public humiliation doesn't heal a private wound, and that Carol never believed accountability was supposed to leave people in pieces. It was supposed to lead them somewhere. He didn't have anything to say back to that for a long while. A few days later, the three of us drove down to the cemetery together to see where Carol's ashes had been placed in the memorial garden she'd picked out herself years before any of this happened. Curtis told her he was sorry. Renee said she'd forgotten how much I'd been carrying, quietly, the whole time. I laid a single lily against her marker and told them both that parents spend their whole lives teaching kids how to walk. The hard part, I said, is teaching them how to walk back. Curtis put both arms around me right there in the grass, the kind of hug he hadn't given me since he was small enough to need one. Healing didn't arrive all at once after that. It came in smaller pieces, Curtis showing up on Saturday mornings with 2 coffees just to sit on the porch, no reason needed. Renee stopping by Thursday nights with groceries and a soup that never quite matched her mother's, which she'd admit herself, laughing about the one ingredient she couldn't seem to get right. Patience, I told her once. Her mother always said patience was the ingredient nobody could buy at the store. My granddaughter, Mia, wandered into my garage one Saturday and asked if I could teach her how to use the table saw the way I'd taught her dad. 3 words that filled up a space in me I hadn't realized had gone empty. We spent the whole afternoon building a birdhouse that came out a little crooked. And when she said it wasn't perfect, I told her neither was our family. But if the foundation's solid, it'll still stand. I think she'll remember that longer than she remembers the crooked roof. A month after all of it, the fire department asked me to speak at a community safety night. And when a man in the crowd asked what made me run toward those cars, I told him the truth that Carol spent 2 years teaching me that every extra minute with someone you love matters more than being careful does. The room went quiet, and then it stood up, not for me, but because they understood exactly what I meant. On what would have been Carol's 62nd birthday, the whole family gathered in our backyard. Renee attempted her mother's lemon bars, and they still weren't right. And we laughed about that too. Curtis grilled the way I'd taught him 15 years ago. As the sun went down, Curtis stood up with his glass and said he'd spent years believing that providing for his family meant showing up for the big things and letting the rest slide, and that he'd forgotten his family included the man who'd been quietly providing for him his whole life. He said he couldn't take back that text, but he could promise I'd never again wonder if somebody was coming to get me. Renee reached over and took my hand and said the same. I looked around that table at my children, my grandkids, and the one chair we'd left empty on purpose, and I told them I thought their mother would be proud. Curtis laughed and said no. She'd be telling us the burgers were burning. Everybody laughed at that, and it felt good. Not because the grief was gone, but because for the first time, joy had found enough room to sit down right next to it. I've come to understand at 61 that families rarely break apart over one terrible night. They come apart slowly, one skipped call at a time, one postponed visit at a time, one quiet assumption that there will always be another chance to make it right. Sometimes there isn't. If somebody just crossed your mind while you were listening to this, somebody who's been waiting on you to pick up the phone, maybe tonight's the night you finally do it. Don't wait for a stranger to hand you back the time you could have spent today.